I'm Pamela, 29 years old, and I'm standing in this elegant private dining room, watching my parents mock the wine I brought to my brother's engagement party. They're laughing about my pretentious hobby and this dusty old bottle I've presented. My mother just called it gas station wine, while my father jokes about my wasted education. Little do they know I'm holding the receipt in my pocket showing $15,000, and that's just the beginning of what I'm about to reveal. Before we dive into how I got here, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated by your own family, hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I turned their mockery into my greatest triumph. Trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless, just like it left them. Let's start from the beginning, shall we? Growing up as the middle child in the Harrison family meant learning early that invisibility could be both a curse and a survival skill. My older brother Derek, now 31 and working as an investment banker, had been wearing the golden child crown since birth. Every report card, every soccer trophy, every girlfriend he brought home was met with praise and admiration from our parents. Then there was Ashley, our 26-year-old baby sister, whose dreams of becoming an actress were funded without question, no matter how many failed auditions or overpriced acting coaches she went through. And then there was me, the quiet one who spent hours reading about wine regions in France, studying soil compositions, and teaching myself about tannins and terroir, while my siblings got showered with attention and resources. When Derek announced he wanted to pursue his MBA at Wharton, our parents, Linda and Robert, didn't hesitate to write a check for $200,000. They threw him a party, bought him a new car for the commute, and my mother even took time off work to help him apartment hunt in Philadelphia. That same year, I approached them about culinary school with a focus on becoming a sommelier. I had researched programs, calculated costs, even secured a part-time job at a local restaurant to help with expenses. Their response still echoes in my mind during quiet moments. My father had actually laughed, not a chuckle, but a full-bodied laugh that made my cheeks burn with shame. "Wine isn't a real career, Pamela," he said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Maybe you should follow Derek's footsteps into finance, something practical." My mother's response was even worse in its casual dismissal. She didn't even look up from her magazine when she said that pouring drinks was something people did when they couldn't do anything else. She suggested I might want to consider teaching instead, something respectable for a woman. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd been a housewife since marrying my father, but pointing that out would have only made things worse. So I did what I'd always done. I made myself smaller, quieter, and figured it out on my own. 3 jobs became my new normal. I opened the restaurant at 5 in the morning for the breakfast shift, attended classes until 3, then rushed to my evening job at a wine bar until midnight. Weekends meant catering gigs, where I could learn about wine service while earning extra cash. My fingernails were constantly stained from polishing glassware, my feet ached from standing all day, and I survived on leftover bread and staff meals. Despite the exhaustion, despite the loneliness of watching my parents post photos from Derek's graduation weekend while I worked a double shift, I excelled. My instructors noticed my palate, immediately said I had a natural gift for identifying subtle notes and understanding wine structure. I graduated at the top of my class, earned my first sommelier certification while still in school, and landed a position at Le Jardin, a Michelin-starred restaurant in the city. The day I called to share the news, my mother put me on speaker while she cooked dinner. "That's nice, dear," she said, the same tone she used when Ashley showed her participation trophies in elementary school. "Derek just got promoted to senior analyst. 6 figures already, can you believe it?" When I mentioned that Le Jardin was one of the most prestigious restaurants in the country, my father's voice came through the speaker asking if I needed money for rent, as if my achievement was just another stepping stone to financial dependency. The real shift in family dynamics came when Derek started dating Grace Wellington. Grace came from old San Francisco money, the kind where streets were named after your ancestors and private clubs had wings dedicated to your family. She was beautiful in that effortless way that required significant effort, with honey-colored hair that was never out of place, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. In front of Derek, She played the supportive girlfriend, perfectly asking about my work with practiced interest. But I caught the way her nose wrinkled slightly when I mentioned working in hospitality, how she'd changed the subject whenever anyone asked about my career at family gatherings. The first time she revealed her true colors was at a family dinner 6 months into their relationship. Derek had stepped away to take a call, and my parents were in the kitchen. Grace leaned across the table, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "It must be so interesting," she said, "working in service. I've always wondered what it's like to wait on people who are living the life you wish you had." Before I could respond, she straightened up that false smile back in place as Derek returned. "I imagine you learn so much about wine from people who can actually afford to drink it." I should have known then that Grace would become another weapon in my family's arsenal of dismissal and degradation. But I was still naive enough to hope that somewhere beneath the condescension and calculated cruelty, my family might eventually see me for who I was becoming, not just the shadow between their two shining stars. That hope would cost me more than I could have imagined, but it would also lead me to a revelation that would change everything. The seeds of my transformation were already being planted in soil they'd deemed barren, and like the best vintages, I just needed time to reach my full potential. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was updating wine inventory at the restaurant. Derek's voice carried that particular tone of fake casualness that meant he wanted something. "Hey, Pam." He started using the childhood nickname he only pulled out when he needed a favor. "So Grace and I have some news: we're getting engaged. The engagement party is next month at Chez Laurent, and I was thinking, since you know about wine and all, maybe you could handle the selection. Grace's family is particular about these things, and we want to make a good impression." I should have recognized the trap immediately, but some pathetic part of me saw it as an olive branch. Maybe this was Derek's way of acknowledging my expertise, of finally including me in a meaningful way. I threw myself into the task with the dedication I brought to every challenge, researching Grace's family preferences, consulting with colleagues about pairings that would complement Chez Laurent's menu, even reaching out to my contacts at various vineyards for special allocations. The afternoon of the engagement party, I arrived early with carefully selected bottles, each chosen to tell a story about the couple's journey. I'd included tasting notes in elegant calligraphy, small details about why each wine was selected. The restaurant's sommelier, Philippe, an old colleague, helped me set up the display. His impressed whistle when he saw the selection made my chest swell with pride. Then my parents arrived. My mother took one look at the wine display, and her lips pursed in that familiar expression of disapproval. "Well, this is certainly elaborate," she said, picking up one of my carefully written cards and setting it down without reading it. "I hope you didn't spend too much on fermented grapes. People are coming for Derek and Grace, not for a wine lecture." My father chuckled at her comment, adding his own wisdom about how nobody really cared about wine stories, they just wanted something that tasted good and got them buzzed. The other guests began filtering in, and I stationed myself near the wine table, hoping to share my knowledge with anyone interested. That's when I noticed my cousin Rachel slip in through the side entrance. Rachel had been the black sheep before me, a corporate lawyer who'd quit to become a social worker. She caught my eye and made her way over, her expression serious. "We need to talk," she whispered, "but not here. Meet me in the ladies' room in 5 minutes." Those 5 minutes felt like hours as I smiled and nodded through my parents' continued commentary about my wasteful education. When I finally excused myself, I found Rachel pacing by the sinks. She grabbed my hands the moment I walked in. "Pamela, I need to tell you something. I was at Grandma's lawyer's office last week for the reading of her will. Remember how your parents said she left everything to be divided equally? They lied. She specifically left $50,000 for your education. Said she knew you'd make something special of yourself. Your parents took it. All of it. They used it for Ashley's acting classes in Los Angeles." The room spun slightly as I processed this information. Our grandmother had died 3 years ago, right when I was starting culinary school. I'd wondered why there was no mention of inheritance, but my parents had said Grandma's estate was smaller than expected, mostly debts. To learn that she'd tried to help me, that my parents had stolen that help, felt like a physical blow. Rachel hugged me as I fought back tears, promising to send me copies of the documents she'd photographed. I returned to the party with this new knowledge burning in my chest, trying to compose myself as the formal toasts began. My father had commandeered the microphone, regaling the crowd with stories about Derek's accomplishments. From his first Little League home run to his summa cum laude graduation, we always knew Derek was destined for greatness, he boomed, raising his champagne flute. And now he's found a partner worthy of the Harrison name, someone who understands what it means to come from good stock. Grace's parents beamed at this, and I watched my mother dab at her eyes with a handkerchief she'd probably bought specifically for this performance. Then my father turned to where Ashley and I stood. Of course we're proud of all our children, he added with noticeably less enthusiasm. Ashley's pursuing her dreams in Hollywood, and Pamela, well, she pours wine. Everyone needs their calling, I suppose. The laughter that rippled through the crowd felt like individual slaps across my face. Grace caught my eye and smirked, raising her glass in a mock toast. Derek stood silent beside her, his smile fixed and empty, refusing to meet my gaze. This was the brother who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd snuck me cookies when I was sent to bed without dessert. Now he just stood there, complicit in my humiliation. The formal dinner began, and I found myself seated at the far end of the family table, practically in exile. Grace's cousin sat beside me, a pompous investment broker who spent the entire first course explaining how the wine industry was dying and smart people were investing in spirits instead. I listened to him drone on while watching my parents fawn over Grace's family at the head table, their voices carrying as they discussed Derek's promising future and Grace's charitable foundation work. Then the wine service began, and everything shifted to a new level of cruelty. My mother had apparently instructed the servers to skip my selections entirely, replacing them with the house wines. When Felipe tried to protest, she loudly declared that family knew best and my choices were too obscure for normal people. I watched months of planning and careful curation get pushed aside for generic bottles that could have been found at any grocery store. Unable to bear another moment, I excused myself and stepped onto the restaurant's terrace. The city lights blurred through tears I refused to let fall. Behind me I heard footsteps and turned to find Richard Castellano, one of the evening's guests I'd noticed earlier. He'd been seated at a table near the back, observing everything with quiet intensity. "Ms. Harrison," he said gently. I couldn't help but notice the wine selection that was cast aside. "May I ask who curated it?" When I admitted it was my work, his face lit up with recognition. "I thought so. I remember you from the Napa Valley Grand Tasting last year. Your palate assessment of the 97 Cabernets was extraordinary. Tell me, are you still at Le Jardin?" We talked for 20 minutes about wine, about the industry, about my dreams of advancing to master sommelier. He listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own insights from 40 years of collecting. When Grace appeared to summon me back inside for the cake cutting, he handed me his card. "We should talk more," he said meaningfully. "I think you're wasting your talents waiting for your family's approval. Some of us recognize excellence when we see it." I returned to the party to find my parents had given my seat away to accommodate one of Grace's sorority sisters. I stood in the back watching my family celebrate while I became increasingly invisible. But Richard's card felt warm in my pocket, a small reminder that someone had seen my worth, even if my own blood refused to acknowledge it. The night was far from over, and the humiliations would continue to stack like bitter sediment in a poorly aged wine. But something had shifted. The spark of rebellion that had been smoldering since Rachel's revelation began to catch flame. They could mock my choices, steal my inheritance, and treat me like hired help at my own brother's engagement, but they couldn't take away what I'd built for myself, not anymore. The weeks following Derek's engagement party brought a series of events that would have broken me if I hadn't already been piecing myself back together with stronger materials. My work at Le Jardin had been exceptional, and my supervisor had put me forward for the Master Sommelier program, a prestigious opportunity that would elevate my career to heights my family couldn't ignore. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and I'd spent months studying with an intensity that reminded me of my culinary school days. Wednesday afternoon, I was called into the office of our general manager, Thomas Beaumont. His expression was sympathetic but firm as he gestured for me to sit. Pamela. I received a concerning call yesterday from someone claiming to be a family member. They expressed worries about your drinking habits, suggested you might be using your position to access alcohol inappropriately. Now I know this is absurd. I've worked with you for 2 years and never seen you take even a sip during service. But with the Master Sommelier Committee's strict standards, I can't risk any shadow of impropriety. I'm sorry, but I have to withdraw your nomination. The blood drained from my face as I recognized my parents' handiwork. My voice barely functioned as I asked who had called. Thomas hesitated before admitting it was a woman identifying herself as my mother, and a man claiming to be my father had called an hour later to confirm the concerns. They'd been very convincing, apparently expressing deep parental worry about their daughter's welfare. The irony of parents who hadn't called me in 6 months suddenly concerned about my well-being would have been laughable if it hadn't just destroyed my immediate career prospects. I stumbled through the rest of my shift in a haze, mechanically pouring wines and describing flavor profiles while my mind raced. It was Emma, one of the servers who'd become a close friend, who finally pulled me aside. She'd overheard Thomas's assistant discussing the calls. Your mom mentioned specific details about your work schedule things only someone close to you would know. How would she even have that information? That's when I realized Derek must have helped them. He'd asked about my routines just last week, claiming Grace wanted to surprise me with a spa day for my birthday. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have. This wasn't just dismissal or mockery anymore, this was active sabotage. They'd reached into my professional world and poisoned it with lies. When I confronted them that evening, showing up at their house unannounced, my mother's response was a study in gaslighting. "We're just concerned about you, sweetheart. All those late nights at the restaurant, the wine tastings, it's not healthy. We thought if they knew about your tendencies, they'd help you get support." My father nodded along, adding that real careers didn't require you to drink for a living anyway. I left their house shaking with rage, but the humiliations were far from over. 2 days later, my mother called with a request that would have seemed reasonable from anyone else. "Your father and I have been discussing the engagement party expenses. Since Derek and Grace are saving for their wedding, and we're helping with that, we think it's only fair that family members contribute to the engagement celebrations. We'll need $3,000 from you by next week." When I protested that I'd already handled the wine selection they'd rejected, she dismissed it with a laugh. "That was your gift to your brother. This is about family obligation." The manipulation was masterful in its cruelty. If I refused, I'd be the selfish sister who wouldn't support her brother's happiness. If I agreed, I'd be depleting the savings I'd painstakingly accumulated for my master sommelier examination fees and study materials. After a sleepless night, I wrote the check, telling myself it was the last time I'd let them manipulate me. I should have known better. Known. The country club's Sunday brunch 3 weeks later was advertised as a casual family gathering to discuss wedding plans. I arrived to find Grace's entire extended family present, 30 people who represented old money and older prejudices. My parents had strategically placed me at the children's table despite being 29 years old, while Ashley held court at the main table, regaling everyone with stories about her latest commercial audition. Halfway through the meal, my mother decided to share what she called amusing family anecdotes. She launched into a story about how I'd once tried to make wine in our basement at age 12, fermenting grape juice in mason jars. What she conveniently left out was that it had been a science project that won first place at the school fair. In her telling, it became evidence of my obsession with alcohol from an inappropriate age. The Wellington family tittered politely, while Grace's mother Margaret studied me with calculating eyes. Derek jumped in with his own contribution, describing how I'd embarrassed the family at his college graduation by correcting the chancellor about the wine served at the reception. Again, the context was stripped away. What actually happened was the chancellor had been curious about the vintage, after I'd quietly mentioned it was exceptional for a university event, and we'd had a lovely conversation about his own collection. But in Derek's version, I was the pretentious sister who couldn't help but show off her useless knowledge. The coup de grace came from Grace herself, who sweetly mentioned how noble it was that I'd found work that suited my limitations. After all, she said with that practiced smile, not everyone can excel in traditional careers. It's wonderful that places like restaurants provide opportunities for those who need alternative paths. Her mother nodded approvingly, and then loud enough for the entire room to hear, suggested that perhaps I'd be interested in working events at their estate. We're always looking for good help who understand wine service. The pay is quite generous for the right person. The implication was clear. In their eyes, I wasn't a professional sommelier at a prestigious establishment. I was potential household staff, someone who could be hired to serve their guests. The fact that no one at the table corrected this assumption, that my own parents nodded along as if this was a wonderful opportunity, told me everything I needed to know about my place in this family dynamic. What they didn't notice was Richard Castellano at a corner table with his wife, observing the entire spectacle. He caught my eye and subtly raised his water glass, a gesture of acknowledgement and support that kept me from fleeing the scene. Later, as I escaped to the parking lot, he intercepted me. "That was quite a performance in there," he said, and he wasn't talking about mine. "I've seen how they treat you, Pamela. It's unconscionable. Have you given any thought to my proposition?" 2 weeks earlier, he'd called to offer something extraordinary. He was looking for a partner in a new venture, someone to help him catalog and auction parts of his extensive collection while building a consultation business for new collectors. The opportunity was beyond my wildest dreams, but I'd hesitated, still somehow believing my family might come around. Standing in that parking lot, my cheeks still burning from humiliation, I finally nodded. When do I start? The revelation that would come at the next family gathering would shake their foundations. But first, there were more betrayals to endure, more cuts to suffer before I could reveal just how badly they'd underestimated the child they'd dismissed. Grace's father, Harrison Wellington, would try to destroy my reputation in the wine community at my parents' suggestion. My credit would be mysteriously ruined by loans I'd never taken out. Each attack made me stronger, more determined to succeed, not in spite of them, but because their cruelty had taught me to rely on myself alone. The best wines, after all, come from vines that struggle. And I was about to produce a vintage they'd never forget. The wedding planning intensified after the country club debacle, with Grace orchestrating every detail like a military campaign designed to reinforce hierarchies and alliances. The Wellington estate hosted the planning session's 30-room mansion that smelled of old money and furniture polish. I attended the first meeting out of obligation, arriving to find Ashley already there, surrounded by fabric swatches and laughing with Grace's cousins as if they'd been friends since childhood. Grace stood at the front of the room with a presentation board, her smile sharp as she began announcing the wedding party. "My maid of honor, of course, will be my sorority sister, Catherine," she began, gesturing to a blonde who could have been her twin. "But I'm thrilled to announce that Ashley has agreed to be a bridesmaid. She'll be perfect for the photos, and her experience in front of cameras will help keep everyone looking their best." Her eyes found mine across the room. "Pamela, I hope you understand that we kept the wedding party small, just the closest friends and family who really get our vision." Ashley had the decency to look uncomfortable for exactly 3 seconds before launching into excited chatter about dress fittings and bachelorette party destinations. My mother reached over to pat my hand with false sympathy. "It's for the best, dear. You'll be so busy with work anyway, and this way you won't have to spend money on a bridesmaid dress." The casual cruelty of suggesting I couldn't afford a dress while they'd forced me to contribute thousands to the engagement party wasn't lost on anyone. Derek sat silent, scrolling through his phone, refusing to acknowledge the deliberate exclusion of his only other sibling. Later that week, the attacks escalated beyond social humiliation. Grace's father, Harrison Wellington, owned one of the largest restaurant groups on the West Coast, and suddenly, the consulting opportunities I'd been pursuing began evaporating. A hotel chain that had been eager to hire me for their wine program called to cancel our meeting without explanation. A private club that had reached out about curating their cellar stopped returning calls. It wasn't until the third cancellation that a sympathetic contact quietly informed me that Harrison had been making calls, suggesting that hiring me would be inadvisable given my family's concerns about my reliability and possible substance abuse issues. The systematic destruction of my professional reputation might have succeeded if Richard Castellano hadn't been working behind the scenes on my behalf. He called me into his private office at the Castellano estate, a room lined floor to ceiling with wines that represented decades of careful collection. "Pamela," he said, pouring 2 glasses of a modest but excellent Burgundy, "I've been in this business for 40 years. I've seen jealousy, I've seen sabotage, but rarely have I seen such concentrated effort to destroy someone's career." The good news is that Harrison Wellington's influence only extends so far. The better news is that I've been making some calls of my own. He laid out a proposition that took my breath away. His collection needed proper cataloging, something he'd been putting off for years. More importantly, he wanted to create a consultation service for new collectors, people with money but limited knowledge who needed guidance building meaningful collections. "I have the connections and the wines," he explained, "but I need someone with your palate, your ability to educate without condescending, and frankly, your hunger to prove yourself. This isn't charity, Pamela. This is a business partnership. 50-50 split after initial investments are recouped." I signed the partnership agreement that afternoon, my hands shaking with a combination of excitement and trepidation. Richard immediately put me in touch with his lawyer to establish the business properly, and that's when the next betrayal revealed itself. During the routine credit check for the business license, we discovered 3 loans taken out in my name over the past 2 years, totaling $30,000. The applications had my social security number, my information, but signatures I'd never made, and addresses I'd never lived at. Rachel helped me investigate using her legal connections to trace the paper trail. The truth was uglier than I'd imagined. My parents had used my information to secure loans for Derek's engagement ring and honeymoon plans, assuming I'd never find out, or if I did, that family loyalty would keep me quiet. The discovery came with another revelation. Rachel had continued digging into our grandmother's estate and found that Pamela wasn't just supposed to receive $50,000 for education. Our grandmother had left her a significant portion of her wine collection bottles that had been in the family for generations. My parents had sold them quietly, using a broker who specialized in discreet transactions. The evidence piled up like sediment in a badly maintained barrel. Bank statements showing transfers from the wine sales directly into Derek's investment accounts. Emails between my parents discussing how to keep me from learning about the inheritance. A particularly damning message from my mother to Grace's mother, assuring her that I'd been kept ignorant of my actual worth to prevent me from getting ideas above my station. Each document Rachel provided felt like another nail in the coffin of my family relationships. But Richard had taught me something valuable during our early meetings. The best revenge isn't emotional, it's strategic. Let them think they've won while you build something they can't tear down. So I threw myself into our new venture with focused determination. Days were spent learning every bottle in his collection, nights studying auction records and market trends. I traveled with Richard to estate sales, learning to spot undervalued treasures and build relationships with sellers who trusted our expertise. The transformation wasn't just professional. Richard's wife Marie took me under her wing, introducing me to a network of women in the wine industry who'd faced their own battles with discrimination and family opposition. Through them, I found mentors, allies, and eventually true friends who valued me for my expertise rather than my bloodline. Emma from the restaurant joined our venture as an events coordinator, bringing her warmth and organizational skills to our growing business. 6 months into our partnership, the results spoke louder than any family gathering humiliation. We'd successfully brokered the sale of a cellar collection for $2 million, earning a commission that dwarfed what I'd made in years of restaurant work. 3 luxury hotels had contracted us for their wine programs. Most significantly, Richard had gifted me 3 bottles from his personal collection as a partnership bonus bottles with a story that would soon become very relevant to my family's narrative. The invitation to Derek's final pre-wedding celebration arrived on expensive cardstock embossed with the Wellington family crest. A private dinner at Chez Laurent, the same venue as the engagement party, full circle in their minds, but a very different geometry in mine. The request was specific. Each family member was asked to bring a wine that represented their relationship with the couple. My parents would undoubtedly bring something flashy, but ultimately common. Ashley would probably forget entirely, and I had something very special planned. Standing in the climate-controlled cellar Richard had given me access to, I held the bottle that would change everything. A 1947 Chateau d'Yquem, one of the most legendary vintages in wine history. The same wine my grandmother had specifically mentioned in her will, the one my parents claimed had been sold to pay for her funeral expenses. Except this bottle had provenance that would prove very interesting when revealed. Richard had acquired it from the very broker my parents had used, complete with documentation showing the seller's name as Linda Harrison. The night of the dinner was approaching, and with it a reckoning years in the making. My family thought they'd successfully diminished me, reduced me to a bit player in their grand production. They had no idea that I'd been preparing for a finale that would rewrite the entire script. The wine was just the beginning. The real vintage I'd been aging was the truth, and it was finally ready to be uncorked. The afternoon of Derek's pre-wedding dinner arrived with the kind of crisp San Francisco weather that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress, one that could pass for either guest attire or server uniform, knowing my family's tendency to blur those lines where I was concerned. The bottle was wrapped in protective cloth inside a specialized carrier, its presence both a weight and a promise as I drove to Chez Laurent. I arrived to find the private dining room already buzzing with conversation. Grace's family clustered near the bar while my parents held court with Derek near the windows overlooking the bay. Ashley was nowhere to be seen, probably running late as usual. What struck me immediately was my designated place card at a small round table near the service entrance, while the main table stretched elegantly down the center of the room. The separation was so obvious that even the waitstaff looked uncomfortable as they noted the arrangements. Grace appeared at my elbow, her voice honeyed with false concern. "Pamela, so glad you could make it. We put you near the service area thinking you'd be more comfortable there, closer to your element. I do hope you brought something nice for the wine presentation. Derek mentioned you might try to show off, but I told him, surely you'd understand this evening is about celebrating us, not your little hobby." Her smile was perfectly practiced, the kind that photographs beautifully while cutting deeply. Before I could respond, my mother materialized with her typical timing. "Oh, Pamela, good you're here. Would you mind helping the staff with the wine service? You know how these things work better than anyone, and the Wellingtons have such sophisticated palates. We want everything perfect." She said this loud enough for Grace's parents to hear, cementing my role as auxiliary help rather than family member. I agreed with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, setting my carrier carefully on my assigned table. The formal presentations began an hour later after Ashley finally arrived in a whirlwind of apologies and air kisses. My parents went first, producing a gaudy bottle of champagne with a custom label featuring Derek and Grace's engagement photo. My father launched into a speech about new beginnings and sparkling futures that had clearly been written by my mother and rehearsed in the car. The Wellingtons applauded politely while I noticed several guests discreetly checking their phones. Ashley's contribution was exactly what I'd expected. A bottle of rosé she'd grabbed from a grocery store on the way, presented with a giggling story about how pink wine reminded her of Grace's signature lipstick shade. The comparison made no sense, but Grace laughed as if it was the cleverest thing she'd ever heard, making a show of hugging Ashley while the photographer captured the moment. Other family members presented their selections with varying degrees of thought and expense. Grace's uncle brought a rare Bordeaux that actually impressed me, while her cousins opted for safe, expensive choices that screamed wealth without personality. Each presentation felt like a performance, complete with rehearsed anecdotes and calculated emotion. I waited patient as a wine aging in oak for my turn. That's when Richard Castellano entered the room. I hadn't expected him, but there he was, elegant in a dark suit, greeting Grace's father with the casual familiarity of equals. Marie was with him, radiant in burgundy silk, and they took seats at a table adjacent to mine. Richard caught my eye and winked, a gesture so subtle I almost missed it. His presence changed the room's energy, though my family didn't seem to notice, too busy fawning over the Wellington connections to recognize actual influence when it walked in. As the presentations continued, Grace made increasingly pointed comments about the wines being offered. Oh, how interesting, she'd say, about each bottle managing to make interesting sound like an insult. Such a unique choice translated to, "What were you thinking?" Her family laughed at her assessments, while my parents nodded along, desperate to show they were in on the joke even when they were often its target. Then came the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The staff at my mother's earlier insistence had been serving the wines in a specific order, and mine was notably absent from the lineup. When I quietly asked Philippe about it, he looked embarrassed. "Your mother said to skip yours, that you'd probably brought something inappropriate, and she didn't want to risk embarrassment. She gave us house wine to serve instead, said to tell people it was your selection if anyone asked." The humiliation was so complete, so perfectly orchestrated, that I actually admired its thoroughness. They'd managed to erase my contribution while simultaneously setting me up to look like I'd failed to participate. Several guests were already murmuring about the generic wine being served, wondering aloud who'd made such a pedestrian choice. Grace's mother specifically asked my mother who had selected the disappointing Chardonnay currently in their glasses. That's when I stood. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying across the room with a clarity that surprised even me. "There seems to be some confusion about the wine service. I did bring a selection for Derek and Grace, but it appears to have been overlooked. If I may," I walked to my table and retrieved the carrier, feeling every eye in the room follow my movement. Philippe, ever the professional, immediately stepped forward with proper glasses and a wine cradle. My mother's face went through a series of expressions, from annoyance to embarrassment to suspicion. "Really? Pamela, is this necessary? We've already served the wines." But Grace, sensing an opportunity for fresh humiliation, intervened. "No, no. Let's see what Pamela brought. After all, she works in wine service. This must be very important to her. Derek, tell your sister to share her little contribution." Derek looked uncomfortable but nodded. "Sure, Pam. Show us what you've got." His voice carried the same patronizing tone he'd used when I was 8 and showing him my art projects. The room settled into an expectant silence, some guests genuinely curious, others clearly anticipating entertainment at my expense. I carefully unwrapped the bottle, handling it with the reverence it deserved. The moment the label became visible, I heard a sharp intake of breath, but it didn't come from my family. Richard Castellano had risen slightly from his chair, his eyes fixed on the bottle. "Marie, is that—" His voice carried across the suddenly silent room. Even Harrison Wellington, who'd been scrolling through his phone, looked up at Richard's tone. The bottle stood on the table like an accusation, its age-darkened label a testament to decades of careful preservation. This, I began, allowing my training to guide my presentation, is a 1947 Chateau d'Yquem, widely considered one of the greatest sweet wines ever produced. Only a few dozen bottles remain in existence worldwide. This particular bottle has an interesting provenance. I paused, meeting my mother's eyes directly. It was purchased from the Marchand brokers 18 months ago, sold by someone who claimed it was a family heirloom that needed to be liquidated for funeral expenses. The color drained from my mother's face as she began to understand what was happening. My father shifted uncomfortably, his hand reaching for his water glass. But I wasn't done. The fascinating thing about wine of this caliber is that every bottle is tracked, every sale documented. This bottle, according to its papers, originally belonged to Margaret Chen, my grandmother, who specifically left it to me in her will. A will, I was told, contained nothing but debts. The silence in the room was absolute, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Richard Castellano moved closer, his expertise lending weight to what was about to unfold. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bottle. I nodded, and he examined it with the reverence of someone who understood not just its monetary value, but its significance. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years in the industry, what Ms. Harrison holds here is indeed authentic. The 1947 Chateau d'Yquem is legendary, not just for its quality, but for its rarity. At current auction estimates, this bottle would fetch between $15,000 and $20,000. Gasps rippled through the room. Grace's carefully composed expression cracked her eyes, darting between the bottle and my face. My mother attempted damage control, laughing nervously. Surely there's some mistake. Mother's wine collection was modest at best, just some old bottles in the basement. We sold them to cover funeral costs, yes, but nothing of this value. Pamela must be confused. But her voice wavered, the lie transparent even to those who didn't know the full story. Richard wasn't finished. What makes this even more remarkable, he continued warming to his subject like the educator he was, is that Ms. Harrison Pamela recently joined my firm as a full partner. Her expertise in identifying and evaluating rare wines is exceptional. In fact, just last month she authenticated a collection that sold for $2.3 million. The commission from that single transaction was, shall we say, substantial. He smiled at my parents. You must be very proud of your daughter's accomplishments. Derek's face had gone from uncomfortable to alarmed. He knew our parents well enough to recognize when their scheme was unraveling, but they'd taught him well in the art of self-preservation, and he stayed silent, unwilling to implicate himself, even as the truth emerged. Grace, however, couldn't resist twisting the knife one more time. How wonderful that you could afford such an expensive bottle for our celebration. Though it seems a bit show-offy, don't you think? Bringing something so extravagant to upstage our event. That's when Aunt Martha stood up from a corner table. I hadn't noticed her arrival, but there she was, my grandmother's sister, who'd been estranged from the family for years. Actually, Grace, I think you're missing the point. This bottle isn't just expensive, it's stolen property. I helped my sister write her will. She left Pamela not just money for education, but 6 bottles from her collection, including 3 bottles of this exact vintage. Linda and Robert told us those bottles were worthless, that they'd spoiled in storage. Yet here's one in perfect condition with documentation proving it was sold by Linda herself. The room erupted. Grace's parents looked mortified at being associated with what was essentially theft. Other relatives whispered among themselves, some pulling out phones to presumably Google the wine's value. Philippe and the service staff tried to remain professional, but I caught several of them exchanging shocked glances. My parents sat frozen, their careful facade crumbling like poorly aged cork. But I wasn't done. The revelations had only just begun. Rachel stood up from her seat near the back, holding a folder thick with documents. Since we're sharing family truths tonight, there's more. Pamela asked me to investigate some irregularities in her credit report. What I found was systematic fraud. Loans taken out in her name, signatures forged, addresses falsified. $30,000 in debt she never knew existed, used to pay for, among other things, a certain engagement ring and honeymoon reservations. Derek finally spoke, his voice desperate. That's not... I didn't... His words died as Grace turned to stare at him, the calculation in her eyes shifting from offense to reassessment. You told me your bonuses covered the ring, she said slowly. You said your parents were gifting us the honeymoon. Her voice rose with each word. Are you telling me you stole from your own sister to pay for my ring? Richard cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the wine and to me. If I may continue, there's something else remarkable about this bottle. Pamela didn't just bring one. He gestured to my carrier, where 2 more bottles remained wrapped. She brought 3 each, worth as much as the first. These aren't just any bottles, they're part of her rightful inheritance recovered through legal channels and proper documentation. Moreover, as her business partner, I can tell you that her personal collection, built through her own expertise and connections, is now worth more than most people's retirement funds. I finally spoke again, my voice steady, despite years of suppressed emotion threatening to overwhelm me. I brought these bottles tonight not to show off, but to honor what Derek and Grace claimed they wanted: a wine that represents our family relationship. This wine was stolen from me just like my education fund, just like my credit, just like my professional reputation when you called my employers claiming I was an alcoholic. Every time I succeeded despite your obstacles, you found new ways to tear me down. But like this wine, I've only improved with age and adversity. My mother attempted one last manipulation, tears filling her eyes as she reached toward me. Pamela, sweetheart, there must be some misunderstanding. We're family. We've always supported you in our own way. But Emma, loyal Emma, who'd witnessed so much, stood up from her seat, supported her. You told my manager at Le Jardin that she was unstable. You convinced vendors not to work with her. You literally charged her for attending her own brother's engagement party while stealing her inheritance. That's not support, that's sabotage. Harrison Wellington cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the chaos. I believe I owe Ms. Harrison an apology. I was led to believe she was unreliable, potentially dealing with substance abuse issues. I see now that I was misled. He looked pointedly at my parents. In my business, reputation is everything. I'll be calling my colleagues tomorrow to correct any misimpressions I may have created. He turned to me. I'd also like to discuss potentially working with your firm. We're always looking for expertise we can trust. The transformation in the room was palpable. Suddenly, I wasn't the failed middle child serving wine to her betters. I was a successful professional who'd overcome systematic family betrayal to build something remarkable. Grace's relatives began approaching me with genuine interest, asking about my business, my expertise, the collection I'd mentioned. My parents sat isolated at their table, their usual allies distancing themselves from the taint of scandal. Grace herself seemed to shrink as the implications hit her. Her perfect wedding, her prestigious union, all of it was built on a foundation of theft and lies. She looked at Derek as if seeing him for the first time, understanding that the golden boy was just brass underneath. The murmurs around the room grew louder as people processed what they'd witnessed. This wasn't just family drama, it was criminal activity, fraud, theft, defamation, all wrapped in the prettier package of parental concern. I carefully poured a glass of the Chateau d'Yquem, the golden liquid catching the light like liquid amber. This wine survived World War II, decades of storage, and ultimately my family's attempt to steal it. It's worth more now than ever before, not despite its journey but because of it. Every challenge made it rarer, more valuable. I raised the glass. To Derek and Grace, may your marriage be as honest as your courtship. The aftermath of that dinner rippled through our social circles like wine spilling across white linen, leaving stains that no amount of club soda could remove. Derek and Grace's wedding proceeded as planned 3 months later, but the grand society event they'd envisioned had transformed into something smaller, tighter, with notably fewer Wellington family members in attendance. I wasn't invited, of course, but Emma attended as someone's plus one and reported that the reception felt like a wake for ambitions rather than a celebration of love. My parents attempted damage control in the weeks following the revelation, cycling through denial, anger, and bargaining with the persistence of people who'd never faced real consequences. My mother called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to veiled threats about family loyalty. My father sent a certified letter drafted by their lawyer demanding I cease spreading defamatory statements about their financial dealings. Richard's legal team responded with a counter letter detailing the evidence of fraud and theft, suggesting that pressing the matter would result in criminal charges rather than civil reconciliation. Ashley, surprisingly, was the first to break ranks. She appeared at my new apartment, a stunning loft in the Marina district that I'd purchased with my partnership earnings, looking younger than her 26 years. They cut me off, she said without preamble when I opened the door. When I wouldn't take sides after the dinner, they stopped paying for my acting classes, my apartment, everything. Said if I wanted to support a thankless daughter, I could do it myself. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on either of us. She'd discovered what I'd always known, that their love came with strings attached, and those strings were designed to control, not support. I let her in, poured her a glass of decent Pinot Noir, and listened as she unraveled years of observations she'd kept to herself. How our parents had poisoned every relationship I'd attempted, calling boyfriends to warn them about my drinking problem that didn't exist. How they'd sabotaged job opportunities, social connections, even friendships, by spreading carefully crafted concerns about my stability. She'd stayed silent, she admitted, because she benefited from being the baby who could do no wrong. But watching them turn those same tactics on her the moment she showed sympathy for me had been a wake-up call. The wine business, meanwhile, flourished beyond my wildest dreams. Richard and I were featured in Wine Spectator's annual issue on emerging talents in the industry. The article, complete with photos of us in his remarkable cellar, positioned me as a rising star who'd overcome family opposition to build something extraordinary. The phone didn't stop ringing for weeks. Collectors who'd previously worked only with established houses wanted the fresh perspective we offered. Hotels and restaurants sought our expertise. Most satisfyingly, several of Grace's family members became clients, including her uncle, whose Bordeaux selection had been the only impressive contribution at that cursed dinner. Emma transitioned from restaurant work to become our full-time operations manager, her warmth and organizational skills perfectly complementing Richard's connections and my expertise. We hired 2 more sommeliers and a marketing specialist, moving into proper offices in the financial district. The Castellano-Harrison Group, as we'd named it, became known for making wine accessible without dumbing it down, for treating new collectors with the same respect as established ones. One year after the Revelation dinner, I was preparing for a major auction at the Four Seasons when my phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Can we talk, please?" I'd been expecting this moment, had prepared for it, but seeing his name still caused a twist of something that might have been grief for the brother I'd once believed in. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown where neither of us was likely to run into anyone we knew. He looked older, grayer, the golden boy tarnish now permanent. "Grace left me," he said without greeting. "Took half of everything, including the money I'd borrowed to keep up appearances. Turns out she never loved me, just the image of success I projected. When that image cracked, she found someone with a more stable facade." He laughed bitterly. "The irony is, I'm broke. The lifestyle, the wedding, trying to maintain Grace's standards, it all caught up. Mom and Dad refinanced their house to help, but even they're tapped out now." I listened without comment as he detailed the collapse of his carefully constructed life, how his firm had passed him over for promotion when whispers about the family scandal reached the senior partners, how Grace's departure had triggered a social exile from the circles they'd worked so hard to enter, how our parents, faced with their own financial pressure, had become bitter and small, blaming everyone but themselves for their circumstances. He looked at me with eyes that might have held genuine regret. "I knew, you know. About the loans, the theft, all of it. I helped them forge some of the documents. I told myself it was for the family, that you'd never need to know." Part of me wanted to feel vindication, but mostly I felt tired. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference, and I'd reached that point months ago. "I'm not going to help you, Derek. Not with money, not with connections, not with forgiveness you haven't earned. What I will do is give you the same chance I had to build something from nothing, to prove your worth, without family money or stolen advantages. Richard needs someone to help with inventory at the warehouse. It's minimum wage physical work, but you'll learn the business from the ground up if you're willing." He stared at me, processing the offer. That was both lifeline and poetic justice. That was 6 months ago. Derek took the job, surprising everyone, including himself. He's still there, slowly learning humility along with proper wine storage techniques. Ashley enrolled in business school, paying her own way through loans and part-time work. She occasionally helps with events, her natural charm actually useful when directed towards something meaningful. Our parents, last I heard, were selling the family home, downsizing to a condo in a less prestigious neighborhood. They still tell anyone who'll listen that I destroyed the family, but fewer people listen these days. As for me, I write this from the terrace of my new home, a restored Victorian in Pacific Heights that I bought with cash from a particularly successful auction season. Marie Castellano helped me decorate, insisting that someone who understood wine's complexity should live surrounded by equal beauty. My cellar, small but carefully curated, holds bottles that tell stories of triumph rather than theft. The 1947 Chateau d'Yquem sits in a place of honor, unopened, a reminder that some things become more valuable for having survived attempts to destroy them. Richard retired last month, making me the sole owner of the company we built together. His parting gift was a letter of introduction to every significant collector on the West Coast and a magnum of the wine we'd shared that first day in his office. "You've exceeded every expectation," he wrote in his farewell card, including your own. "The girl who poured wine has become the woman who shapes the industry." The transformation was worth witnessing. Success, I've learned, isn't about proving wrong those who doubted you. It's about proving right those who believed in you, including yourself. My family tried to shrink me into something manageable, controllable, less than. Instead, their pressure created someone stronger, more focused, absolutely unwilling to accept limitations imposed by people who couldn't see past their own prejudices. I don't hate them anymore. Like a wine that's turned to vinegar, they're simply no longer worth tasting. The requests still come occasionally. Ashley asking for investment advice she's actually willing to follow. Derek sharing small victories from the warehouse floor. Even my parents, through intermediaries, testing whether time has softened my boundaries. But I've learned that family isn't about blood or obligation or manipulation disguised as love. It's about the people who see your potential and nurture it rather than trying to steal it. It's Emma who believed in me when I barely believed in myself. It's Richard and Marie who showed me what supportive parenting actually looks like. It's the community of wine professionals who welcomed me based on merit rather than pedigree. Tomorrow I'm flying to Bordeaux to meet with vintners about an exclusive import arrangement. Next month I'm speaking at the International Wine Symposium about building authentic relationships in the luxury market. My calendar is full of opportunities. I created successes. I earned a life I built from the ashes of what my family tried to burn down. The wine they mocked cost $15,000. The freedom their cruelty taught me to claim priceless. To those watching who've ever felt unseen, undervalued, or actively sabotaged by people who should have been your champions, know this. Your worth isn't determined by their recognition. Sometimes the greatest gift toxic people can give you is revealing exactly who they are freeing you to become, exactly who you're meant to be. Like that precious vintage in my cellar, you might need time, proper conditions, and the right moment to reveal your true value. But when you do, the taste of that triumph will be sweeter than any wine ever poured. Thank you for joining me on this journey from mockery to mastery. If my story resonated with you, if you've faced similar struggles or emerged stronger from family betrayal, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. How did you reclaim your worth? What moments of revelation changed everything? Share your stories below, and let's create a community of people who understand that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose. Please like this video if it touched your heart, subscribe for more stories of triumph over adversity, and share it with someone who needs to hear that their current circumstances don't define their future potential. Remember, the most expensive wine in the world can't compare to the value of self-respect, and that's something no one can steal from you. Until next time, may your glasses be full of whatever brings you joy, and may your lives be even fuller of people who celebrate your success rather than trying to diminish it.